Thank you. 20 minutes is a short time, so I'm going to talk fast. Apologies in the start for the Luddite technology. I barely use email, so my students at the University of Virginia, when I left, gave me a quill pen to celebrate my incompetence in using computers. I think Stephen and Dennis will uphold the pride of the profession later on, because I see they've got a computer. Why are there two outlines? Because the one I was going to give is the type prepared. The written one, the one I'm actually going to give, is the written one I did last night. I thought it would be more helpful to this group to do what I was, to not do what I was going to do, which is talk about a particular form of incompatibilism and compatibilism with regard to epiphenomenalism, and particularly the technicalities of backtracking counterfactuals. I thought it might be more helpful to talk about what we talked about for the last 3 days and put it into my own organizational matrix, and you can see what you think. I take that second talk to be inspired by a couple of speakers. One of them, John Dylan Haynes, had said he thought perhaps there were challenges other than the challenge of lack of free will in the sense I'm going to talk about. And I think that's true. I think neuroscientific findings of the kind that he himself or Libet or others have issued a series of challenges beyond simply the traditional one that all human choices cause. I take my other inspiration from Peter von Imwagen's paper on the degree to which free seems to be an amorphous term. It is, I think, until you stipulate what it is that interests you about it, and if what interests you are the challenges neuroscience presents to responsibility, then stipulate that free means the set of circumstances don't exist that aren't challenging in the way that you thought, and unfree will mean there really is a challenge, in which event we can stipulate meanings from our particular interest. Isaiah Berlin once had said that there are over 200 senses of the word freedom. That may be right, and I had a plethora of them in our various discussions. But in terms of the ones that are relevant to challenging responsibility from the insights of neuroscience, I think there are 4 dominant usages, and that's why this little chart. I want to do 3 things. I want to walk you through the first 2 columns of the chart and the 4 senses of free, unfree that they in fact mark out. 2, I want to talk about 2 sorts of questions that you can ask about each challenge, which gives you the 3rd column on the chart, known as 4 kinds of compatibilism. And then I want to, thirdly, talk as much as I can about one of those forms of compatibilism, which was going to be actually the talk I intended to give, to epiphenomenalism as a particular challenge. Let me see how fast I can go. Okay, first, in terms of the 4 sorts of challenges, remember at the end of the first session, I had asked Peter von Imwagen, didn't he think the speakers for that day had actually illustrated a particular, if not dominant, popular sense of the word free and unfree? Namely, to be free in your choices is to have those choices in one version not caused, in another version not subject to nomically sufficient laws, causal laws. In either case, to be free has to do with the absence of causation, either singular or causal laws. That's the determinism versus libertarianism debate, and I think Peter Arnim's paper on whether amoeba could do otherwise, Hans Brown's paper, Aku's paper, all used free, unfree in that sense and dealt with that issue. Oliver Lee's incompatibilism uses it in that sense. Tim O'Connor has half of his definition of free will quite self-consciously adopted to an uncaused choice, although in his case it's qualified. It's a partly uncaused choice. If it's partly uncaused, that's enough freedom for him. It doesn't have to be, as he said, totally uncaused. So that's the first opposition, determinism, libertarianism. The second opposition is the one that Walter Sinnott Armstrong introduced us to. That's, as he said explicitly, what he takes to be the real challenge of the Libet to Haynes chain of experiments through Patrick Haggard, through Lau and others, which is to find the causal antecedents of choice in certain brain events, whether in the parietal cortex, the supplementary motor area, or wherever. To find those causal antecedents is to make you skeptical of responsibility, not because they cause the choice. That's the first sense in which they challenge, that's the determinist sense in which they challenge responsibility, but rather because what they show is that choice does no causing. David Hume said, the kind of freedom you want, the liberty that's worth something, is the liberty to have your choices cause the object of them, namely, to realize through your actions what it is you most want. That, he said, is the liberty worth wanting. Being uncaused is of no value. Being a cause through your choices, that's of value. So liberty in the second sense, to be free, is to be someone who believes in the causal theory of action, as I have on the chart. To be unfree is someone who believes in the epiphenomenalism of will, which Walter was going after in some detail. I think Thomas Pink's discussion about powers brings that in. I thought Liad's presentation very clearly was using liberty in that sense. And Tim O'Connor, I think, very self-consciously, when he distinguished efficacious from free choices, and ultimately defining his notion of free will in two terms, namely one that is partly uncaused and a will that is causally efficacious, explicitly uses freedom in this second sense as well as part of what his overall definition of free will would mean. If you turn to the second page of this outline, you'll see a little chart of the limit experiments to bring out the epiphenomenal challenge into more focus. I'm with John Dylan Haynes. I think it is completely unsurprising. What's surprising is that anyone was ever surprised by there being brain events, either of the kind measured by the readiness potential or by John Dylan's work on the parietal cortex using fMRI rather than EEG. It's surely unsurprising. There are causal antecedents of choice in the brain. So let RP represent whatever your favorite theory of brain event is at T1, which for Libet is for type 2 decisions, that is voluntary rather than planned or stimulated, is 550 milliseconds before the signals hit the motor plates on the muscles. At 250 to 150 milliseconds, depending on how you measure it, we get the famous W point, the onset of the experience of willing. And then later on, ultimately at T3, the motor plates begin to move. That is, the signal hits the motor plates and the muscles start to move. There is that stop action point, which if it's not from the outside, Libet measured at 50 milliseconds, which gave him that famous 100 millisecond veto window that we talked a bit about yesterday. I want to leave that part out. Now notice from that data, a normal construal might be the one that Al Neely makes in his book Effective Intentions, parodying, I take it, the ineffective intentions, which are the title of the seeming title of the Daniel Wegner book about the illusion of conscious will. So in Effective Intentions, Al says, look, if you have a lighting of a match at T1, and a burning of a fuse at T2 and an explosion at T3, this normal thing to say is it's a causal chain, like number one. Namely, the brain event goes off, there's a willing, and the willing causes the bodily movement. So temporal order is no argument whatsoever about an epiphenomenal relationship. You might have co-causation like in 1A, but leave that complication to the side. The claim of people like Walter Sinnott Armstrong is the implication that Libet wants to derive from his experiments, and post-Libetans as well, is something like 2, 3, and 4. 3 kinds of epiphenomenal relationships, of which the most basic is number 2. The brain event is the common cause of 2 events, but there's no causal relationship across the horns of this epiphenomenal fork. So that the W point, W let's call it for willing, is an effect of the readiness potential. The bodily movements is an effect of the readiness potential. But what challenges responsibility is not the causal relationship between RP and W, that's just determinism. What causes skepticism about responsibility is the lack of a causal relationship between W and the bodily movement, which is why this is an epiphenomenal fork rather than a causal chain. That kind of skepticism is one that is, I think, well worth rebutting. Walter takes a stab at it in trying to show how at least mental causation is possible. Notice he didn't show us how that rebuts the epiphenomenal claim. He only shows how mental states could cause. He didn't show that they did cause, contrary to his own construal of the epiphenomenal construal. Well, Mark Hallett actually introduces 3 and 4 as possible. What did did you call that thing? It was you had a chart, a particular model that you had up there on the, now I've forgotten what it was. But anyway, you had a model of actually either 3 or 4 as the epiphenomenal forks. You get that way this way. One of the common responses to Libet in the 85 Symposium in Brains and Behavior was that, like Arthur Dono, philosopher of action at Columbia, why don't you put W as willing up with readiness potential, because what readiness potential really betokens is the onset of willing, not an urge, as Al has said, but actually it's the beginning of the intending. If you do that, then the epiphenomenalist still has this objection, number 3. Namely, if willing is up at the readiness potential at 550 milliseconds, then it's still the case that consciousness of willing is back in the nomological dangler position as a thing that has no causal impact. And if consciousness of willing is needed for responsibility and not just willing, then you get skepticism from number 2. Now, some people have said, yeah, but consciousness is a brain process. It takes real time, in which event you move consciousness in the sense of a physiological ramping up of whatever consciousness is in the brain back to T1, and you get the readiness potential, the willing, and consciousness in this physicalist sense back at T1. Well, then that leaves phenomenal experience in the nomological dangler position. You get your 3rd epiphenomenal challenge, so long as you think phenomenological awareness is itself necessary for responsibility, that is, that it has causal result to the causal relation to the bodily movement. So 3 kinds of epiphenomenal challenges. Why is it the case that some of the people at this conference, and actually more commonly, confuse challenge number 2 with challenge number 1? What I've noticed over the years is the tendency to think the following: that human choice is this peculiar creature that, in order to be a cause of things like bodily movements, it itself must be uncaused. If you think that, then if you think it's caused, it can't itself be a cause, and you get both skepticisms thrust together. But how on earth would you establish this point, that a choice to be a choice must be uncaused? I was giving this rejoinder to a philosopher at Northwestern, and I made this point. I said, looking out at Lake Michigan, look at the lake. Let me tell you the geology, the formation of the lake. Didn't take very long. I don't know very much geology. Water table, glaciation, scooping stuff out. And I said, now look again, did the lake disappear? To explain is usually not to explain what. It did disappear for him. He was so insulted by the question, the guy got up and walked out, so his back was to the lake. But for the rest of us, it was still there. Choice has to be unlike lakes, that by its nature, or by the meaning of the word, it has to be uncaused, but the burden is on those who think that to say so. So for most of us, we want to do what Tim O'Connor did, which is carefully distinguish inefficacious wills from uncaused wills. Those are 2 different points, 2 different skepticisms, 2 different things to say to them. Let me be more brief with the other 2. Peter Am had said, it was remarkable yesterday that we hadn't really discussed mind-brain relations very much until Al Mealy got us to talk about dualism a bit. It is the case that many people think that the findings of neuroscience challenge responsibility not just by showing there are causal antecedents of choice or that the choice itself is not causally efficacious. They also think that being reduced to a machine in some way makes us lose our locus of value, that we can't be responsible agents if we're just machines. John Stuart Mill on Liberty says, if you're in fact programmed in a certain way, you're just like a steam engine, you're not of value. There is that intuition that somehow, independently of the skepticism coming from causation, we need to be more magical than that. So I put physicalistic reductionism down, mechanism, as a kind of basis for skepticism, so that to be free in this sense is to reject that form of physicalistic reductionism. There are those halfway houses called non-reductionist physicalisms, but as Al points out, the real refuge for this view is dualism, metaphysical dualism, of the kind that Sir John Eccles or his teacher Sherrington or his collaborator, in a sense, Libet, I think all very consciously subscribe to. Why does one confuse this sense of freedom with the determinist sense? It's for exactly the reasons that Al pointed out. It's the people who think if you need to be free in the libertarian sense that your choices are uncaused, you need a way in which which that freedom can be insulated from the normal influence of causation, give it a special place that exists in time but not in space, doesn't have mass and doesn't have energy, and all of a sudden you have this dualism of the kind that Eccles used to chart with his mind-brain interface charts. Gives you a place in which to be free. So I think you end up with this third sense of freedom. You're free to the extent you're not a mere machine. You're unfree to the extent that you are just a mechanism. Number 4 was the least mentioned of our group. Number 4 was what I call the fallibilist challenge. It came up a bit in Mark Hallett's example of the hand where you have an illusion of control case, the way that Daniel Wegner does. Remember, Wegner's book has 2 kinds of cases in it to make his argument. One is the illusion of control case, where you think you're acting but you're not. The other is the converse case, what John Bart calls the automaticity of everyday life. Namely, you're acting but you don't know that you are. What's Wegner's point? It's not the point for which is commonly cited, which there's no causal relationship between the will and bodily movements. That's skepticism number 2. It's rather the challenge of an epistemic story. We think we have knowledge of that connection when we really don't. We're quite inaccurate. We have no privileged access to that connection. That is a fourth and distinct kind of challenge. To be free in this sense is to be empowered by knowledge, privileged access. To be unfree is to be disempowered by the lack of that knowledge. So, first thing I wanted to say, 4 different senses of freedom, all stipulated senses answering again to this dominant concern. What are the challenges arising out of the data of neuroscience for responsibility that you can usefully use to taxonomize a free-unfree opposition? Doesn't mean you're right about any of them, it simply means you're trying to get plausible challenges. Now the second thing I want to say, I'll say very briefly. There's 2 things to discuss when anybody makes any claim whatsoever. My old friend Nick Sturgeon, fellow traveler in the meta-ethical wars of the 80s, made the mistake of listening to his graduate student outside the door when he was discussing Nick's lectures for the week. And the graduate student had divided everything Nick said into 2 camps, headed first by, oh yeah, and secondly by, so what? I said, you know, you should prize that guy because he's got a really good organization. Namely, is it true is one question about a claim, and does it matter to what we're concerned with here is the second. It's what lawyers do when they have general denials and confession and avoidance. General denials deny the point, confession and avoidance admits the point arguendo, but says it doesn't establish what you think it establishes. So 2 questions to ask about each of these 4 senses of challenge. One is it true that human choice is determined? Is it true that it's epiphenomenal? And the second is, does it matter if it's true to responsibility? The third column of the chart is the compatibilist answer to the it doesn't matter. The first column is the second column is the general denial. It's not true. Compatibilism is the standard label for people who say it doesn't matter to responsibility that human choices are caused. But there are compatibilisms for each of these challenges, even though I think they're much less common in philosophy. I'm under 5 minutes, so I won't even go through any of compatibilism as an answer to the determinist challenge. There's some awfully quiet compatibilists hiding out there. Al Beatty, I know, is one, but he hasn't fessed up to it. Till is a compatibilist. Stephen Morse will probably proclaim it. He's not so quiet. And then there's the anti-compatibilists. Oliver certainly is one, Peter von Imbogen. So hardly a universal position, but a very popular position in philosophy, and one to which I subscribe. I wrote this article, as Stephen would say, the article by my favorite author, for neuroscientists, saying there's 9 or 10 plausible compatibilisms in philosophy. Why don't you go shopping? Because if you buy one of those, it's going to free your science from defending a perimeter you don't need to defend. You think you're helping us, lawyers and ethicists, by studying randomness and finding quantum effects at the macro level in human choice, because you're preserving something we have to preserve to have responsibility. If you become convinced, like many of us, that compatibilism in this sense is true, we don't need your help. Which means you're free to do any kind of research you want, which is perfectly good. I mean, look, sometimes a gazelle really needs to be random vis-a-vis the lion, and it's great to study that stuff. But we don't need the help to be finding randomness or indeterminacy in human choice to have responsibility. So, this is your dispensation of freedom from the lawyers, if you're a compatibilist. The compatibilism that really interests me is number 2, because it's not a popular form. There aren't very many compatibilists who think you can deny the causal theory of action and have responsibility. Remember when David Hume says the liberty worth wanting is the causal efficaciousness of your choice, a compatibilist is someone who says you don't even need that. There aren't very many people who think that. What I tried to do in the talk that I was going to give, and if you turn to that second outline, you'll see a chart at the end that actually gives a very short form of the argument. Some epiphenomenal forks, the common purport of which is this: can you not control some things that you do not cause? Can't you control them by the backtracking counterfactuals which philosophy post-David Lewis have held have valid truth conditions and make a great deal of sense that Lewis thought they did not? Can't you control things some of the time by the backtracking counterfactuals which, if you, the agent, know and utilize, can bring about even though you're not causing the result? The famous example of Jennifer Hornsby is this one. The golf instructor, first of the epiphenomenal charts in the chart, the golf instructor tells his client, you need a square hit on the ball or you're going to hook the damn thing. Here's how you get a square hit. Get a good follow-through. The good follow-through is at T3. It cannot, therefore, cause the square hit at T2. But nonetheless, if you focus on the follow-through, you will get a square hit. In which event you say to yourself, well, since there's no backwards causation, what's really being utilized is an epiphenomenal fork. Namely, if you focus on the follow-through, you can get a good follow-through only if, counterfaction depends upon, it depends upon getting a certain psychological set which causes the follow-through, and isn't it nice that the set that causes the follow-through also causes a square hit? So by virtue of controlling the follow-through, in light of the common cause of the set that causes it also causes what you want, you can use as your means the later event, the follow-through, for what you want as your end, the earlier event, the square hit. Now suppose we take that to neuroscience, number 2. Neuroscience, the thought experiment goes like this. Suppose that Libet, Haynes, and everybody in between in neuroscience goes back to the American Revolutionary War. And there they're waiting in the North Tower for the signal. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Dawes and Revere are waiting to awake the troops to take on the British for the shot heard around the world. Unfortunately, the guy in the church in the North Tower is paralyzed because the British shot him through his spine, so he can't move his fingers. But the Libet to Haynes mind-brain interface machines have been set up so that if he wills the movement of one finger or wills the movement of that finger twice, you'll have distinctive forms of either EEG or fMRI patterns. Suppose you put an amplifier on either of those machines, connect it to the lights of the Old North Church, and you get 1 or 2 lights. The British, the American rebels are warned. Dawes and Revere make their famous ride and alert the rebels. Can the British, if they win the war, can the British hang the person in the North Church for alerting the British in action? Is it an act? Is it an act for which he's responsible? I think the intuition's plainly yes. If the epiphenomenal fork is correct, he can't have caused the lights to go off. What he did is what the golfer did. He did something that he knew would have to be preceded by a brain event, which itself would then cause the desired effect. But it's only by virtue of his use of that backtracking counterfactual that he controls something that he doesn't cause. Lots of problems with that, which is worth a detailed exploration, but not after the bell. Thanks.